Number 1. Sandy Hook Elementary School. Adam Lanza. It was a quiet December morning in Newtown, Connecticut. The kind of day that should have been ordinary. School buses pulling up, kids clutching backpacks, teachers greeting students at the door. But within hours, the name Sandy Hook would become forever etched into history as one of the darkest moments in modern America. Adam Lanza was 20 years old. On the surface, he was a quiet, introverted young man who kept to himself. Born in 1992, he grew up in Newtown with his mother, Nancy Lanza, after his parents' divorce. Those who knew him described him as intelligent but distant, a young man who struggled socially and often preferred isolation over interaction. He attended several schools before completing his education through alternative programs. His mother, Nancy, was known in the community as a caring, attentive parent who worked hard to provide stability for her son despite his challenges. But behind closed doors, their lives were far from ordinary. Adam's mental health had long been a concern. Reports later revealed that he lived an extremely reclusive life in his final years, rarely leaving his room, communicating with his mother mainly through email, and spending long hours online reading about past mass shootings. Nancy, unaware of the extent of his internal turmoil, tried to manage his anxiety and routines, hoping that time and patience would help him find peace. Then came December 14th, 2012. That morning, before the world had any idea what was coming, Adam Lanza acted in a way no one could have predicted. He first turned on his mother, taking her life in their home. Then he drove to Sandy Hook Elementary School, a place where he himself had once been a student. Armed and dressed in black, he entered the school around 9:35 a.m. What happened inside in those few minutes would shake the nation. 20 children and 6 staff members lost their lives that day. The rampage ended when Lanza took his own life as police closed in. By the time first responders entered the building, the scene was beyond comprehension, a tragedy so profound it would redefine the conversation around school safety forever. In the aftermath, investigators began the long process of trying to understand what led to such devastation. Police found thousands of digital files, notes, and online searches at Lanza's home. They showed a disturbing obsession with past mass shootings and an intense isolation from the outside world. There were no signs of an accomplice, no manifesto, and no clear explanation, only fragments of a mind consumed by despair and detachment. The official investigation by the Connecticut State Police revealed that all weapons used in the attack were legally purchased by his mother. This revelation fueled an intense national debate over gun control and mental health access. The tragedy led to the introduction of new safety protocols in schools across the country and the formation of advocacy movements such as Sandy Hook Promise, dedicated to preventing similar tragedies through education and awareness. Because Lanza took his own life before authorities could apprehend him, there was never a trial, never a chance for cross-examination or closure in a courtroom. The legal aftermath focused primarily on accountability and prevention. Families of the victims later pursued civil actions against firearm manufacturers and misinformation spreaders who targeted survivors, resulting in significant settlements years later. As time passed, Newtown became a symbol of both heartbreak and resilience. The old Sandy Hook Elementary School building was eventually demolished, and a new facility was built on the same site, not to erase what happened, but to give the community a place to heal. Each year, memorials honor the victims, ensuring their names and stories remain alive beyond the shadow of tragedy. Reflecting on this case is to confront the darkest corners of human fragility, where isolation, mental illness, and access to weapons intersected with devastating consequence. There was no single cause, no simple explanation, no villain in the cinematic sense, just a chain of missed signs, silent suffering, and irreversible loss. Sandy Hook stands as one of the most haunting reminders of how quickly ordinary life can turn into history's darkest chapter. It's a story that forces a painful but necessary question. How can a society protect its most innocent when danger can come not from strangers, but from within its own walls? The community of Newtown continues to carry the weight of that day, turning grief into advocacy and remembrance into purpose. For many, the legacy of Sandy Hook isn't just about the tragedy itself. It's about the lives that were lost and the collective vow to ensure that such horror never happens again. Number 2, Virginia Tech, Seung-Hui Cho, April 16, 2007, began as a normal spring morning on the campus of Virginia Tech in Blacksburg, Virginia. Students hurried to class under a soft gray sky, unaware that the day would become one of the deadliest in U.S. history. Within hours, 32 lives would be lost, and a university community would be forever changed. Seung-Hui Cho was a senior at Virginia Tech, majoring in English. Born in South Korea in 1984, he moved to the United States with his family at age 8. They settled in Virginia, where his parents worked long hours running a small dry cleaning business. From a young age, Cho was quiet and withdrawn. Teachers noted his extreme shyness and difficulty speaking in class. As he grew older, his silence became more troubling. By high school, counselors were aware of his struggles with anxiety and depression, but after graduation, he entered college and tried to start fresh. At Virginia Tech, Cho lived in a dormitory and attended writing classes. His professors quickly noticed his disturbing essays, often describing violent or unsettling scenes. Concerned faculty referred him to counseling, but Cho rarely followed through. Classmates described him as detached, often avoiding eye contact and speaking in a low, barely audible voice. He lived in near isolation, spending long hours on his computer and avoiding social interaction. Then came the morning of April 16th. At around 7:15 a.m., Cho entered West Ambler Johnston Hall, a dormitory, and took the lives of 2 students. The incident initially appeared isolated. Police responded, but with no suspect description and no indication of what was coming, the university continued with classes. 2 hours later, Cho reappeared across campus at Norris Hall, armed and wearing a vest full of ammunition. What followed was an attack that lasted roughly 11 minutes but felt like an eternity. Cho moved through classrooms and hallways, targeting students and professors who tried desperately to barricade doors or escape through windows. When police finally reached the scene, Cho took his own life. The gunfire ended, leaving behind 33 dead, including Cho, and 17 others injured. In the aftermath, investigators faced a difficult question. Who was Seung-Hui Cho, and how had he reached this point? They discovered that Cho had meticulously planned the attack for months. He had purchased his weapons legally, despite documented mental health concerns. Years earlier, a court had ruled him mentally ill and ordered outpatient treatment. But due to gaps in reporting systems, that information never reached federal databases that could have prevented him from buying firearms. Further investigation revealed that before the second wave of violence, Cho had mailed a package to a major news network containing photos, videos, and a manifesto-style message. In it, he portrayed himself as a victim of social rejection and injustice, a chilling insight into his distorted worldview. The footage was released after the attack, sparking public outrage and deep ethical debate about media responsibility. The legal aftermath focused on accountability and systemic failure rather than prosecution, since Cho was deceased. Lawsuits followed against the university, claiming that administrators failed to properly warn students after the initial dormitory incident. In 2008, the state of Virginia agreed to a settlement with victims' families, acknowledging mistakes in communication during the critical hours of the crisis. Virginia Tech also faced the monumental task of rebuilding its community. Memorials were erected and scholarships established in honor of those lost. The tragedy prompted sweeping national reforms in how schools and universities handle mental health records, emergency alerts, and campus safety. It also fueled ongoing debates about gun regulation and the balance between privacy and public safety. Cho's case became a study in warning signs, how isolation, untreated mental illness, and access to weapons can combine into something catastrophic. Professors had seen red flags in his writings, classmates had felt uneasy around him, and counseling services had briefly intervened, but no one could connect all the dots in time. In the years that followed, Virginia Tech became known not only for the tragedy it endured, but also for its resilience. The community chose unity over fear, strength over despair. Each April, a candlelight vigil honors the victims, students and professors who lost their lives doing what should have been the safest thing in the world, learning. Looking back, the story of Seung-Hui Cho forces a difficult reflection on the quiet warning signs society often overlooks. His silence was his mask, his isolation his world. Behind it was a storm no one truly saw coming. Virginia Tech remains a symbol of both grief and courage, reminding the nation that awareness, compassion, and vigilance are essential if such a day is ever to be prevented again. Number 3. Marjory Stoneman, Douglas High School. Nicholas Cruz. February 14, 2018, a day meant to celebrate love and friendship, instead became one of the darkest in American school history. At Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, what began as an ordinary afternoon ended with heartbreak and loss. In just a few minutes, 17 people were killed and 17 more were injured. The man responsible, Nicholas Cruz, would soon face justice in a courtroom watched by the entire nation. Nicholas Cruz was born in 1998 and adopted as an infant, along with his younger brother, by Roger and Linda Cruz. The family lived in a quiet Florida suburb, and for much of his early childhood, life seemed stable. But as Cruz grew older, teachers noticed troubling behavior, mood swings, outbursts, and difficulty following rules. After his father passed away when he was 6, things became harder at home. His mother, Linda, tried to manage his struggles with the help of counselors and special education programs, but the problems deepened. Cruz attended several schools, facing suspensions and transfers for disruptive and aggressive conduct. By high school, his fascination with weapons and violent themes had become well known. Classmates described him as isolated, often sitting alone and showing anger toward others. In 2017, after repeated disciplinary issues, he was expelled from Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School. Around that same time, he legally purchased the semi-automatic rifle later used in the attack. On the afternoon of February 14th, Cruz arrived at the school by taxi, carrying a rifle bag and wearing a dark shirt emblazoned with a tactical vest. At approximately 2:19 p.m., he entered the campus through an unlocked gate, moving toward Building 12, the freshman building. Within seconds, the first shots were fired. Panic erupted as students and staff scrambled for cover. Teachers barricaded doors, students hid behind desks, and others fled down hallways as alarms blared throughout the school. The attack lasted about 6 minutes. Cruz moved floor to floor before discarding his weapon and blending in with the escaping students. He then walked to a nearby fast food restaurant, calmly bought a drink, and was arrested less than 2 hours later without resistance. The scale and swiftness of the violence left investigators stunned. As authorities pieced together what had happened, they discovered a long trail of warnings that had gone unheeded. The FBI later admitted it had received tips about Cruz's disturbing online posts, but had not acted on them. Local law enforcement had also been called to his home multiple times in the years before the shooting. Each incident hinted at instability, but none led to a decisive intervention. Cruz was charged with 17 counts of premeditated killing and 17 counts of attempted killing. His defense team quickly offered to have him plead guilty in exchange for life imprisonment, but prosecutors pursued the death penalty. The trial, delayed several times due to procedural and pandemic-related issues, began in earnest in 2022. During the proceedings, the courtroom was filled with emotion. Survivors recounted their experiences. Families of victims listened in silence, clutching photos of loved ones. The prosecution argued that the act was deliberate and calculated, pointing to months of planning and detailed internet searches. The defense focused on Cruz's mental health, citing lifelong emotional disorders and the impact of losing both adoptive parents before the age of 19. After lengthy deliberation, the jury recommended life imprisonment without the possibility of parole rather than the death penalty, a decision that divided public opinion. In November 2022, the court formally sentenced Nicholas Cruz to life in prison, closing one of the most closely watched trials in Florida's history. Since then, Cruz has been held at a maximum security facility where he remains under strict supervision. He has expressed remorse in brief public statements. Though many families of the victims have said no apology could ever undo what happened. The Parkland tragedy had far-reaching consequences. It reignited the national conversation about school safety, mental health, and firearm regulation. Most notably, it inspired a student-led movement called March for Our Lives, where survivors from Marjory Stoneman Douglas became prominent voices for reform. Their advocacy led to policy changes in several states, including the introduction of red flag laws designed to temporarily remove firearms from individuals deemed a threat to themselves or others. For the Parkland community, healing has been a long and difficult process. The high school has rebuilt parts of its campus, and memorials now stand in honor of the victims, students and teachers who represented hope, promise, and courage. Each anniversary brings remembrance ceremonies, not only to mourn, but also to remind the country of the importance of prevention and vigilance. Nicholas Cruz's story is one of missed signs and irreversible loss. Behind the tragedy lies a series of failures in communication, in intervention, and in recognizing the depth of one young man's unraveling. The case forced the nation to confront uncomfortable truths about warning systems, mental health resources, and the balance between personal freedom and public safety. The name Parkland has since become more than a location. It is a symbol of grief, resilience, and activism. Out of unimaginable pain, a generation found its voice, determined to ensure that no other school, no other family, would endure the same horror again. Number 4. Robb Elementary School, Salvador Ramos. On May 24, 2022, the small town of Uvalde, Texas, became the center of a national tragedy. Robb Elementary School, a place meant for learning and laughter, turned into a scene of heartbreak that shook the United States. In a matter of minutes, 19 children and 2 teachers lost their lives. The man responsible, Salvador Ramos, was just 18 years old. Before that day, Ramos was known mostly as a quiet and withdrawn teenager. Born in North Dakota and raised in Uvalde, he grew up in a working-class family and attended local schools. Friends and classmates later described him as isolated, someone who struggled to connect, often keeping to himself. Over time, his behavior became more erratic. Social media posts hinted at growing anger and a fascination with weapons. He reportedly dropped out of high school and worked at a local fast food restaurant where co-workers noticed his silence and unpredictable moods. Those who knew Ramos said his life was marked by instability. He often clashed with family members and had few close friends. Online, he began posting alarming messages, photos of firearms, and cryptic comments about wanting attention. Despite this, there was no formal intervention. As he turned 18, he legally purchased 2 AR-style rifles and hundreds of rounds of ammunition from a local gun store, all within days of his birthday. The morning of May 24th started like any other in Uvalde. Teachers welcomed students for the last week of the school year, classrooms decorated with colorful artwork. Around 11 a.m., Ramos shot his grandmother at their home. She survived and called police. He then took her truck and drove toward Robb Elementary School. At approximately 11:33 a.m., he crashed the vehicle near the campus, got out carrying a rifle, and walked toward the school building. Security footage later revealed that Ramos entered through a side door that had been propped open. Once inside, he moved into adjoining classrooms filled with fourth-grade students. The situation quickly escalated, but confusion and miscommunication would soon define the response. Police officers arrived within minutes, yet over an hour passed before they entered the classroom where the children and teachers were trapped. When law enforcement finally breached the room, Ramos was confronted and died at the scene. The damage, however, was already unimaginable. 19 children and 2 educators had been killed, and countless others were left traumatized. In the days that followed, Uvalde became the focus of national mourning and anger. Investigations began immediately, not only into Ramos's actions, but also into the law enforcement response. Reports later found that officers had hesitated to confront him sooner, mistakenly believing the situation had shifted from an active threat to a standoff. That hesitation became one of the most criticized aspects of the tragedy. As officials pieced together Ramos's history, a clearer picture emerged of a young man struggling with mental and emotional instability. He had no criminal record and had not been diagnosed with a major psychiatric disorder, but he had displayed concerning behavior online for months. Posts on social media platforms showed him making violent threats, sometimes directed at young people. Authorities later confirmed that he had even messaged an acquaintance about his intentions just before the attack. Because Ramos lost his life during the police intervention, there was no trial, no sentencing, and no opportunity for formal justice. Instead, the focus turned toward accountability and prevention. Multiple agencies launched investigations into the police response, school security, and background check systems. The U.S. Department of Justice conducted a detailed review, concluding that poor coordination and communication failures had cost precious time. For the families of Uvalde, grief turned into advocacy. Parents and community members demanded stronger gun laws and better mental health services. In response, Texas officials introduced new safety measures, and at the federal level, the bipartisan Safer Communities Act was passed, the most significant gun legislation in nearly 30 years. It strengthened background checks for young buyers and funded mental health programs across schools. The site of Robb Elementary School became a memorial of flowers, candles, and handwritten notes from across the country. The building itself is now scheduled to be replaced, a decision made to help the community heal. Uvalde's residents continue to push for answers and reform, ensuring that the lessons learned from that day are never forgotten. Reflecting on Salvador Ramos's actions, what stands out is how many warning signs went unnoticed. His growing isolation, fascination with violence, and troubling online behavior pointed to a young man in crisis. Yet, like so many cases before, the intervention came too late. Uvalde's tragedy was not only about what happened inside a classroom, it was about the systems and failures that allowed it to happen at all. The town now stands as both a place of sorrow and of strength, where families have turned their pain into purpose. Every candle lit for the victims is a reminder that safety in schools is not guaranteed, but must be constantly protected. In the end, Robb Elementary became a symbol of the need for change in how we listen, how we act, and how we care for those who seem lost. What happened there can never be undone, but through remembrance and reform, the people of Uvalde strive to make sure it is never repeated. Number 5, Columbine High School, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold. April 20th, 1999, the day that changed how the world viewed school safety forever. Columbine High School, in the quiet community of Littleton, Colorado, became the site of one of the most infamous school tragedies in history. What unfolded that day not only shocked the nation, but reshaped the way schools prepare for and respond to threats. The two perpetrators, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, were both students at Columbine. Their plan was calculated, their motives complex, and their actions left an indelible scar on an entire generation. Before that morning, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold were seen by many as typical teenagers, bright, sarcastic, and sometimes rebellious. Harris was born in Kansas in 1981, the son of an Air Force pilot, and had lived in several states before settling in Colorado. He was intelligent and technically skilled, known for his interest in computers and video games. Dylan Klebold, born a year earlier in Colorado, came from a well-educated family. He was quiet, shy, and often overshadowed by Harris's stronger personality. The two met in middle school and quickly became inseparable. Both felt alienated from their peers, describing themselves as outsiders. Over time, their friendship evolved into a dangerous alliance. They shared a growing resentment towards society, often expressing anger in private journals and online postings. Teachers noticed flashes of creativity in their writing, but also glimpses of darkness. In 1998, they were arrested for breaking into a van, but after completing a diversion program, they appeared to move on, at least outwardly. In reality, the pair were quietly planning something far more sinister. For over a year, they gathered weapons, ammunition, and homemade explosives. They recorded video diaries, known later as the basement tapes, where they discussed their motives and goals. What they intended went beyond a simple attack. They wanted to cause mass destruction and make their names known worldwide. On the morning of April 20th, Harris and Klebold arrived at Columbine High School wearing black trench coats to conceal their weapons. At around 11:19 a.m., they began their assault outside the school cafeteria, where they had placed propane bombs meant to detonate before students gathered for lunch. The bombs failed to explode, forcing them to move to Plan B, a direct attack. For nearly 50 minutes, chaos consumed the school. The two moved through hallways, classrooms, and the library, targeting students and staff indiscriminately. By the time the gunfire stopped, 12 students and one teacher had been killed, with many more injured. Harris and Klebold took their own lives before police entered the library, ending the assault. The aftermath was one of disbelief and heartbreak. The media coverage was massive, and questions poured in. Why did this happen? How did no one see the signs? Investigators scoured their homes and computers, uncovering journals, videos, and bomb-making materials that revealed the extent of their planning. Harris's writings showed traits of psychopathy, manipulation, lack of empathy, and a belief in superiority. Klebold's writings, by contrast, expressed deep depression and self-hatred. Together, their psychological profiles painted a disturbing picture of two young men whose partnership magnified their darkest impulses. Because both attackers died at the scene, there was no trial, no verdict, and no sentencing. Instead, the focus turned to prevention and understanding. Columbine became a case study in how warning signs can be missed and how institutions can fail to recognize escalating danger. Both boys had displayed troubling behavior, violent school projects, dark online posts, and even explicit threats. Yet these signs were never connected. The impact of Columbine was profound and far-reaching. Schools across the United States changed their security protocols, introducing lockdown drills, school resource officers, and emergency alert systems. Law enforcement also redefined its response strategy to active threats. Instead of waiting for specialized units, officers are now trained to engage immediately. Culturally, Columbine reshaped the conversation around youth violence, mental health, and media influence. It led to studies examining how isolation, bullying, and exposure to violent imagery can affect vulnerable individuals. Parents and educators became more aware of the importance of early intervention and open communication. The Columbine community has spent decades rebuilding. Memorials stand near the school, honoring the victims, bright young lives, and a teacher who sacrificed himself to protect his students. Every April, vigils remind the world that behind the headlines are real families still healing. Reflecting on Harris and Klebold, experts often describe their partnership as a mutual reinforcement of hate. Separately, they might have remained angry but contained. Together, they created something catastrophic. The tragedy has since served as a warning of what happens when untreated anger and alienation collide with access to weapons and a desire for notoriety. More than 25 years later, Columbine remains a reference point for every conversation about school safety. Its legacy is painful but instructive. It reminds us that understanding the roots of violence and acting on the warning signs is not just prevention, but a moral obligation. For the survivors, the pain endures, but so does the resilience. Their voices and the lessons learned continue to guide a generation determined to make sure such a day never happens again. Number 6. Santa Fe High School. Dimitrios Pagortzis. It was a quiet Friday morning in Santa Fe, Texas, on May 18, 2018. Students were settling into their first period classes at Santa Fe High School, the kind of ordinary morning no one could ever imagine turning into a national tragedy. But within minutes, the sound of gunfire shattered the calm, and what followed would become one of the deadliest school shootings in Texas history. Dimitrios Pagortzis was just 17 years old at the time, a junior at the school, known by classmates as a shy, quiet student who often kept to himself. Teachers said he was intelligent, respectful, and had shown no obvious signs of aggression. He was a member of the school's football team and even took part in a dance group at a local Greek Orthodox church. But those who knew him later said there was another side, one marked by growing isolation, fascination with violence, and resentment toward peers. Investigators later found writings in his personal journal, where Pagortzis expressed dark thoughts and admiration for symbols of rebellion and death. In the weeks before the attack, he began collecting weapons from his home, a shotgun and a .38 caliber revolver, both legally owned by his father. At around 7:30 a.m. that Friday morning, Pagortzis walked into his art classroom wearing a black trench coat, even though it was warm outside. Hidden beneath it were the two firearms. Without warning, he began firing at his classmates and teacher. The classroom erupted into chaos. Students dove for cover, some ran into closets, and others escaped through back doors. For roughly 30 minutes, the gunfire continued. Police officers quickly arrived and engaged in a tense standoff with the shooter. Eventually, he surrendered without incident, telling police that he had planned to kill himself afterward, but didn't have the courage to follow through. When the scene was secured, the toll became clear. 10 people had lost their lives, 8 students and 2 teachers. 13 others were wounded. The victims included both longtime educators and young teens who had their entire futures ahead of them. The community of Santa Fe, a small town outside Houston, was left in disbelief. As investigators pieced together what had happened, They discovered makeshift explosives inside the school, pipe bombs and pressure cookers, though none of them detonated. The evidence suggested careful planning, not a spontaneous act. In interviews, Pogortses claimed he spared certain students he liked, saying he wanted his story to be remembered. Those statements only deepened the pain of the victims' families, who saw no explanation that could make sense of such loss. Pogortses was charged with capital murder and aggravated assault on a public servant. However, the case would take an unusual turn in the years that followed. After multiple mental health evaluations, courts determined that he was incompetent to stand trial due to severe mental illness. As of recent reports, Pogortses remains confined in a state psychiatric facility, undergoing periodic reviews to determine whether he could ever face trial. The Santa Fe High School shooting reignited national debates about school safety, firearm access, and mental health support. Survivors and parents of victims became vocal advocates for reform, pushing for stronger security measures and awareness of early warning signs among students. For the Santa Fe community, healing has been a slow and painful process. The school reopened, but for many, the memories of that morning still linger. The sound of the fire alarm, the screams in the hallway, and the loss of 10 lives that should have never been taken. In the years since, teachers and students have worked to honor the victims' memories through memorials and scholarships, turning grief into action. Yet for those who lived through it, the question remains: how could such horror come from someone who once sat beside them in class? Number 7. Oxford High School. Ethan Crumbley. It was November 30th, 2021, a normal Tuesday in the small town of Oxford, Michigan. Students at Oxford High School were counting down the days until winter break. The halls were filled with chatter, laughter, and the sounds of lockers slamming shut between classes. But within minutes, an ordinary morning would turn into one of the most haunting days in the school's history. Ethan Crumbley was just 15 years old, a sophomore at the school, who teachers described as quiet but intelligent. To most classmates, he was the type who blended into the background, someone you might not notice walking by in the hallway. But behind that calm exterior, a far more troubled story was unfolding. In the days before the attack, teachers and administrators had noticed alarming signs. Ethan had been seen researching ammunition on his phone during class, and disturbing drawings were found on his schoolwork, sketches of weapons, and messages expressing hopelessness. His parents were called in on the very morning of the tragedy to discuss those warnings. They were shown his drawings and asked to take him home. But instead, they left the school without him. Hours later, Ethan would commit a devastating act that left the country shaken. At around 12:50 p.m., students heard the sound of gunfire echoing through the hallways. Panic erupted instantly. Many thought it was a drill at first, until the screams and chaos made it clear it was real. Ethan, armed with a 9mm Sig Sauer handgun that had been purchased by his father just days earlier, moved through the building with chilling precision. Within 5 minutes, 4 students lost their lives, and several others, including a teacher, were wounded before Ethan was taken into custody without resistance. The immediate aftermath was filled with heartbreak and disbelief. Oxford, a close-knit community of about 3,000 people, struggled to comprehend how such violence could erupt in a place that had always felt so safe. As investigators pieced together the timeline, they discovered that the weapon used in the attack had been bought during a Black Friday sale, and that Ethan had referred to it online as his new beauty. What made the Oxford case stand apart from so many others was the legal aftermath. For the first time in U.S. history, prosecutors charged the parents of a school shooter with involuntary manslaughter, arguing that they had ignored clear warning signs and failed to secure the weapon safely at home. Both James and Jennifer Crumbley were accused of gross negligence for their actions leading up to the shooting, from purchasing the handgun to refusing to remove their son from school that morning despite obvious concerns. Ethan himself faced multiple charges, including terrorism causing death and first-degree murder. In 2023, he pleaded guilty to all counts. During his sentencing, he was given life in prison without the possibility of parole, a rare and severe sentence for someone his age. The judge cited the premeditated nature of the attack and the devastating impact on the community as reasons for the decision. His parents' trials also drew national attention, as they became symbols in a growing debate about accountability, whether parents should bear responsibility when their child commits such an act with a weapon they provided. Both were eventually found guilty and sentenced to prison, marking a first-of-its-kind outcome in the American legal system. The Oxford High School shooting prompted nationwide conversations about mental health, gun storage, and school threat assessment. It revealed how layers of warning signs, drawings, online posts, emotional distress can sometimes go unaddressed until it's too late. In the years since, Oxford has worked tirelessly to rebuild. The school created memorials and scholarships in honor of the victims: Tate Meyer, Hannah St. Juliana, Madison Baldwin, and Justin Schilling. 4 young lives lost far too soon. Survivors still speak about the moments of bravery that day: teachers who protected students, classmates who led others to safety, and first responders who rushed into danger. Looking back, the Oxford tragedy stands as one of the clearest examples of how a series of missed warnings can lead to irreversible loss. It forced the country to ask a difficult question: how many signs have to be ignored before action is finally taken? Number 8, Marshall County High School. Gabriel Parker. It was a cold Tuesday morning in Benton, Kentucky, on January 23, 2018. Students at Marshall County High School were arriving for another day of classes, standing in the crowded commons area where they met before the first bell. For most, it was just another school morning: laughter, backpacks slung over shoulders, and the usual shuffle to first period. But within seconds, that ordinary scene would turn into panic and chaos as one of their own classmates opened fire. The shooter was 15-year-old Gabriel Parker, a quiet, academically strong student who had never been in serious trouble before. Teachers described him as polite and mild-mannered, the kind of kid who faded easily into the background. He came from a stable family, had good grades, and showed interest in science and technology. But what no one realized at the time was that he had been planning something devastating, quietly and methodically. That morning, Parker brought a .22 caliber handgun from home, tucked away in his backpack. Around 7:57 a.m., he walked into the school's main atrium, where dozens of students were gathered. Without saying a word, he pulled out the firearm and began firing into the crowd. The sound echoed through the halls. Confusion turned instantly into horror as students ran for their lives, some jumping over tables, others fleeing into classrooms and out the nearest exits. When the shooting stopped, 2 students, Bailey Holt and Preston Cope, both 15, had lost their lives, and more than a dozen others were wounded. The attack lasted less than 2 minutes. Parker tried to blend in with fleeing students, but was quickly stopped and taken into custody by law enforcement officers responding to the scene. As news spread, the small town of Benton was left shattered. Marshall County was a rural, tight-knit community where everyone seemed to know everyone else. For many, the idea that someone like Gabriel, a boy who had never shown signs of violence, could commit such an act was unthinkable. During questioning, Parker confessed to the attack and said he had planned it in advance. Investigators later found journals where he wrote about wanting to cause chaos, describing feelings of frustration and alienation. There was no evidence of bullying or abuse, just a chilling calmness in how he spoke about wanting to experience what it would feel like to take lives. Prosecutors charged him as an adult with 2 counts of murder and 14 counts of first-degree assault. His defense argued that he was mentally unwell, too young to fully comprehend the magnitude of his actions. But the evidence, including his written notes and deliberate planning, painted a picture of intent. In 2022, after years of legal proceedings, Gabriel Parker pleaded guilty to all charges. During sentencing, families of the victims spoke directly to him in court, describing their pain, the loss of their children, and the community's struggle to heal. The judge sentenced Parker to 2 life sentences, with the possibility of parole after 50 years. For many, it was a moment of closure, but not of peace. The shooting led to renewed discussions in Kentucky and across the U.S. about how to recognize signs of internal turmoil in young people before they escalate into violence. Teachers and counselors in Marshall County received expanded training in threat detection and crisis response, while the high school underwent renovations to improve safety and security. Each year, the community gathers to remember Bailey and Preston, 2 bright, kind-hearted students whose futures were stolen in an instant. The tragedy left scars that time alone can't erase, but it also brought the community closer, inspiring acts of kindness and resilience. Today, Gabriel Parker remains incarcerated in a state prison, serving his sentence. He has never publicly explained what drove him to that decision, leaving behind only questions and sorrow. For those who survived, the memories of that morning, the sudden panic, the screams, the silence afterward remain vivid. It stands as a stark reminder that even in the quietest corners of America, tragedy can unfold without warning, forever changing a town that never saw it coming. Number 9. Marysville-Pilchuck High School, Jalen Freiberg. It was October 24, 2014, at Marysville-Pilchuck High School in Washington State, a bright Friday morning just before lunch. Students filled the cafeteria, laughing and chatting as they prepared for the weekend. It was homecoming season, and Jalen Freiberg, a 15-year-old freshman, had recently been named to the school's homecoming court. To most people who knew him, he seemed happy, confident, and popular. A football player from a respected Tulalip tribal family. No one could have imagined what he was about to do. Jalen wasn't an outsider or a bullied teen. In fact, he was well-liked, known for his big smile and easygoing attitude. Teachers admired him, teammates respected him, and friends saw him as the kind of person everyone wanted to be around. But beneath that surface, Jalen had been struggling with emotional turmoil. In the days leading up to the tragedy, he had been posting cryptic and painful messages on social media, words hinting at heartbreak and despair after a falling out with close friends and a breakup with a girl he cared deeply for. That Friday morning, Jalen texted a small group of friends, people he was close to, and invited them to have lunch together at a specific table in the cafeteria. When they arrived, they found him already sitting there, calm and quiet. Without warning, he pulled out a .40 caliber handgun that had been taken from his father's home and began firing. The attack lasted only seconds, but the impact was devastating. 4 of his friends lost their lives in the days and weeks that followed, and another was seriously injured before Jalen turned the gun on himself. The school fell into chaos. Students ran from the cafeteria. Teachers locked classroom doors, and emergency crews rushed to the scene. For many who were there, it felt impossible to process. Jalen Freiberg, the homecoming prince, had just carried out a school shooting that claimed the lives of the very people he cared about most. Investigators later revealed that the weapon Jalen used had been legally purchased by his father, who had not realized his son had taken it. The FBI found no signs of external influence, extremist ideology, or online radicalization. Instead, the tragedy appeared to be deeply personal, driven by emotional pain, confusion, and impulsive rage. The victims were identified as Jalen's close friends and relatives, part of the same extended Tulalip tribal community. This made the grief even heavier. Not only had a community lost several young lives, but it was also forced to mourn both the victims and the shooter, all from families who had known each other for generations. In the aftermath, the Tulalip tribes and the Marysville community came together in a remarkable show of unity. Vigils were held. Prayers were shared in both English and Lushootseed, the native tribal language, and support centers were established to help families and students process the trauma. The phrase, "We are Marysville, we are Tulalip," became a message of healing that echoed through the region. The school reopened weeks later under heavy emotion. Counselors and mental health professionals were brought in, and the cafeteria, the site of the tragedy, was completely redesigned to help students reclaim the space. The tragedy also led to new initiatives in Washington schools focusing on emotional well-being, early intervention, and firearm safety awareness. Jalen Freiberg's father was later convicted of unlawful possession of a firearm and negligent storage, receiving a prison sentence. It was a painful legal process for a family already shattered by loss, but it underscored the importance of securing firearms, especially in homes with teenagers. Years later, Marysville-Pilchuck High School still honors the memory of those who were lost that day: Zoe Galasso, Gia Soriano, Shaylee Chuckelnasket, and Andrew Freiberg, 4 young lives taken far too soon. Survivors have since spoken out about forgiveness, hope, and the importance of recognizing signs of emotional distress before it's too late. The Marysville-Pilchuck tragedy stands as one of the most heartbreaking examples of how pain, left unspoken, can spiral into devastation. It wasn't a story of hatred or revenge, but of despair, a reminder that even the people who seem the happiest can be silently falling apart inside. Number 10. Red Lake Senior High School. Jeff Weiss. It was March 21, 2005, on the Red Lake Indian Reservation in northern Minnesota, a quiet, snow-covered community where everyone knew each other. That Monday began like any other at Red Lake Senior High School, with students gathering in hallways and classrooms, unaware that one of their classmates was about to commit an act that would shake the entire nation. The person at the center of it all was 16-year-old Jeff Weiss. To those around him, Jeff seemed like a complex and often withdrawn teen. He was quiet in class, usually keeping to himself, and had struggled for years with personal tragedy. His father, a tribal police officer, had taken his own life when Jeff was just a child. His mother had been severely injured in a car crash and was living in a care facility. Jeff was raised by his grandfather, a respected member of the tribal community, but he carried deep emotional pain that few truly understood. In the months leading up to the attack, Jeff had shown signs of growing isolation. He spent much of his time online, where he created dark drawings and posted disturbing messages expressing anger, hopelessness, and fascination with violence. He had also faced bullying at school for his appearance and reserved nature. Those who later looked back said the warning signs had been there. But in a community already struggling with loss and limited resources, few realized how close he was to breaking. On that Monday afternoon, Jeff carried out a devastating plan. He first went to his grandfather's home, where he took the life of both his grandfather and his grandfather's companion, then took his grandfather's police-issued handgun, shotgun, and patrol vehicle. From there, he drove to Red Lake High School. At around 2:45 p.m., Jeff pulled up to the school's main entrance and began firing. He shot a security guard who was stationed near the door, then entered the building and continued down the hallway toward classrooms filled with students. Panic erupted as teachers rushed to lock doors and students hid wherever they could. Within minutes, 7 more people were killed: 5 students, a teacher, and the security officer. Several others were wounded before Jeff turned the gun on himself. The entire attack lasted just a few minutes, but its impact was immeasurable. In total, 10 people died, including Jeff himself. For the Red Lake Nation, a community already burdened by loss, the tragedy was almost too much to comprehend. It was one of the deadliest school shootings in U.S. history at the time, and one that struck especially deep because it took place in a small, close-knit indigenous community that had rarely seen national attention. Investigators searched for answers in Jeff's past, in his family history, his online writings, and his mental health. They found that he had been prescribed antidepressants, struggled with suicidal thoughts, and felt increasingly alienated from both his peers and society at large. There were no co-conspirators, no outside influences, only a young man consumed by despair, resentment, and pain that had gone unaddressed. The federal government and tribal authorities launched a joint investigation, and President George W. Bush later spoke publicly about the tragedy, offering condolences to the Red Lake community. The FBI worked closely with local leaders to understand how the system had failed to detect Jeff's deteriorating mental state. The findings led to calls for improved access to mental health care and suicide prevention programs within tribal communities, where such services were often scarce. In the years following the attack, Red Lake rebuilt slowly, focusing on healing and remembrance. The school was renovated, and counseling centers were opened for survivors and families affected by the tragedy. Ceremonies were held each year to honor those who were lost, moments not only of mourning, but of unity and cultural resilience. Tribal elders emphasized forgiveness and spiritual recovery, teaching younger generations that acknowledging pain is a path toward strength, not shame. The Red Lake Nation became an example of how a community can endure even the deepest grief, finding ways to reclaim hope after unimaginable loss. The story of Jeff Weiss is one of sorrow and warning, a reminder of what can happen when trauma, isolation, and hopelessness collide. It underscores the importance of listening, of noticing when someone begins to withdraw, and of ensuring that help is available long before tragedy strikes. For Red Lake, the scars remain, but so does the determination to make sure no young person ever feels that alone again.